of their work into Svelte. And so this workshop is for everybody to get started. I think Svelte is an easy one to get started with and works well for beginners compared to some of the other languages, which we'll see. And it's very flexible, so you can start with a simple chart, or you can also get to things that are very, very flexible and very unique. All right, so if everybody could go to the if you're planning on following along, if everybody could go to the ERC website, erc.barnard.edu. And click on the workshops tab. Okay, if we scroll down under spring 2023, all the way at the end, there's a link for Svelte. And if we open up that link, there's another link to a markdown file that we'll be working with today. So I put this here so that you can copy things from here. Some of it we'll type out together because I think the best way to learn is by doing. But because there is quite a bit of code, some things are here so that I can make it easy to copy over. Not everything that we'll be doing today is in here. This will be updated at some point to include everything, but for now it's most of what we'll be doing, but there are some things that are not included in this markdown file. Okay, and so the first thing we'll do is we'll actually open up Code Sandbox. That's this first link here. So I'm going to right click and open a new tab. And for you, it probably is not going to look like this. For me, it looks like this because I'm logged in. So if you're not logged in on the page, at some point it should say create a new sandbox. And again, the way I got here was I clicked on this first link, the Code Sandbox link. Is everyone good so far? Does everybody have Code Sandbox up? Okay, awesome. Like I said, mine, because I'm already logged in, it doesn't look like, it looks a little different, but yours should, if you scroll down, there should be somewhere that says create a new sandbox. You don't need to sign in to be able to do that. The signing in just helps if you want to save your project. Okay, and then you should be able to click somewhere new from a template. Maybe I should log out so you guys can see it the same way. Get this link for us to use later. Okay. Let me log out now so that you guys can see what it looks like. Oh, I actually don't know. Yeah. Okay, when you first go to this link, if you're not logged in, it should look maybe something like this. You can either sign in or you could just go back to the home page. So if I get rid of this, and it just takes me here to the home page. And if you scroll, it should say create sandbox. And we can either just start from scratch or we can create from a template. So the first thing we'll do is we'll create from a Svelte template so that we can see, what that sort of looks like. So in templates, just search for Svelte, S-V-E-L-T-E. And we're going to start with the second example. What Code Sandbox is a place for us to both write code and immediately see like the rendered results. So we don't really have to worry about things like compiling our code, which you would have to if you were working on your own computer. Is there a way for us to change it out of the dark view? Just go back to the regular view for the computer.
In the Chrome settings.
Oh, maybe at the end. Just because some of the styling won't come through.
Yeah, this was an issue last time too. Oh. Let's see.
Is it into settings at the bottom, privacy terms, but I don't see that. It's one. Yeah, this looks different. I think open up Google. Just look at Google window. Like in a new tab, just go to like Google.com. And click on this.
Starting off. Gathering to open a new one.
It says there's another thing you can try. If we open up a new tab,
Mhm.
and then the bottom button to customize comment. I mean, it's okay. I guess we can work without it. That's fine.
Right, let me troubleshoot on my computer while you continue
Okay.
with this, and then I'll let you know. Sorry, I reduced it.
That's okay. So, like you all already saw, so because there's dark mode on here, this may look slightly different for you. So for example, this button is, I think, like orange or red on yours. Let me open it up on my computer so like I know exactly what it looks like for you as well. Okay, so yeah, it should be orange. And if you were to click it, like you can see that it's changes from click 0 times to 1 time and changes so on and so forth. So these are some of the, this is a Svelte app, a very basic Svelte app. And so we'll quickly look through some of the components. And then I'll open up some other examples for you all to look at the different languages that make up this thing. So one, here, this like main file is called an index file. It just says import app from this other file, app.svelte. And so this is something you'll see, which is a default thing in Svelte. And it pulls up whenever you kind of start any Svelte project. And it's all of your code, usually you'll put in your app file. So let's go to the app file and see what's here. So any Svelte file will have usually 3 tags. One is the script tag, and a tag, you can see it starts with a less than sign and ends with a greater than sign. And there's an opening tag. And then at the end, there's always going to be a closing tag for that item. And the closing is always the same word with then just a slash. Okay, so there's script, there's style, and there's main. Script is where you have any JavaScript code. Style is where you have any styling that applies to the code. And then main is where you have your HTML. Okay, so this is one of the languages, HTML. The other thing you work with when you work on the web is CSS. HTML tells the app what to create, so the web page. So H1 is a header, H2 is another header. It's a little bit smaller. There are things like button, etc. So I'm going to open up You don't need to do this. I'm going to open up an example HTML one for you all so you can see some of those things. Just to get us an idea. We're not going to go, today's not going to be a tutorial covering in-depth HTML, CSS, etc. It's just for you to understand so that we can kind of go through this whole thing together. So this is HTML. Here it's showing us there's H1s, H2, H3, it goes up until H6. These are all of those headers. P elements, which are paragraph elements. You can do things like bold text, italicized text, etc. And you can see that all here. Then you have things like tables. There's lists that you can create. You can add images. And so on and so forth, and buttons and labels, etc. Okay, so that's like a little very quick just look at HTML. And then CSS is what applies styling to these things. I don't know if there's a good CSS example, but any site that you'll work with will always have some type of styling. So for example, here in this Svelte document that we're working with, we've said for main, any font that's there, give it this font family, and then align the text to the center. So this is CSS code. If I highlight it, and if you want to comment out any code in Svelte or in this like code in Sandbox, you can highlight and then press Control/. I think on a Mac it should be Command/, and it will comment that out. And notice now how the font changes and everything goes to the left-hand side. So it goes to the default. And so this styling is what changes. It will change things like size, spacing, color, among many other things. CSS has a lot of abilities, and we're really going to only just cover the very immediate kind of aspects of it. Okay, so I'm just going to uncomment this. And again, to uncomment as well, you just highlight and press Control/, and then that brings it back. Okay, and one thing that we can see here that this app is doing is it's importing something from another file. So it's importing a button from another file called button. And once you import something, you can then use it in your HTML. To differentiate between things that are already HTML elements like H1, H2 versus something that you've created, you'll see those are usually you use capital letters. And those won't have a closing tag the same way. Those will just have a slash and a greater than sign at the end. So that is what's pulling in this button. If I comment out this line, you'll see that the button disappears. Okay. So first things with Svelte, just to kind of give you like a little overview of how we'll be working with it. So here in the JavaScript code, we can create a variable. So we'll say let to create the variable, and that's using JavaScript. And we'll say, let's create this X variable, and we'll set it equal to, actually, let's say I'll create a name variable, and I'll set it equal to my name. So I'll say let name equals, and then in quotations, I'll write my name. If we want to use it in our code in the HTML, if we want it to show up, we can't just write out name. So let's say if instead of hello code sandbox, if I wanted to say hello Fatima, if I delete this and just write out hello name, it says name. It doesn't actually switch to my name because right now it's just like regular text. If you wanted to refer to this variable that you created here, you have to put it inside brackets. So you can either add the open and the end at the end, or we can highlight it. And if we press shift and our curly brace, it will add both at the beginning and the end if you've highlighted the word. And now you can see that it says hello Fatima. So that's how we work with variables in Svelte. Any questions so far? Okay, awesome. And then let's add a regular button element underneath. So this time, because it's a regular HTML element, not the import, we're just going to say slash, and we'll say a regular, just write out in lowercase letters button. And then I'll just write out some text, just test for what the button should say, and then close it off with a less than sign, slash, and button. And we can see now there's another button here. Although it's not obvious on my screen, On yours, it should be obvious that the two look very different. And that's because one of the things that's nice about Svelte is it has what's called scoped styling, where whatever styling you've applied to a button, if it's not in this file, if it's in this other file, it only applies to the button in that file. If you've ever worked with web development before, that's one thing that can be really frustrating, where if you apply some styling to, let's say, a button element or a P element or H1 element, etc., it applies to everything. So then you have to use what are called CSS classes to then differentiate between the different types of buttons and different type of elements. Okay, so let's actually look at our button.svelte code. Let's go over there. We can see again, this one also has a script tag. It has a style tag, and it doesn't have a main tag. It just says something that you want to import. And that's because app is the main one that we're working with. So we don't need a main here. This is just importing this into the main. And here there's a little bit of extra JavaScript. So there with a button, you have a function you can use called onClick. So what happens when you click on a button? And to refer to that in Svelte, you write on:click equals, and then in the curly brackets, you write either the name of a function or like we did before, variable. But on this, we're going to put the name of a function called handleClick. And we can see that in script, there's a function called handleClick. You write the name of the function, you have curly braces, and it says, once this function is run, update count by 1. So this is like JavaScript logic and other programming languages as well. This just updates count by 1. Okay, and then one last thing that we see here is where it says clicked, and then in brackets, it says count for the number of times it's been count. And then you see this thing in curly braces. It says count equals 1, question mark. And then it says quotation time, colon, quotation times. So here what it's doing, this first thing is saying check if count equals 1. If it equals 1, so whatever the first thing is, it's if it's true, write time. If it's false, write times. So that's just if it's 1, it's going to say clicked 1 time, versus if it's more times, it'll say times instead. Okay, so that just allows you to, based on sort of conditional logic, change what's on the screen. We'll do one other thing. So here in our script, let's create a variable called double count. So I'll say let double count equals count times 2. And of course, it doesn't show up on our screen because, we didn't do anything underneath. We just added it in our script. So let's go down here. And then let's just, in our curly braces, let's write in double count. And you can press tab to autocomplete. And I didn't really, because I didn't put an HTML element around it, that's why it's like on the same line. It's not really styled, etc. That's fine for now. We just want to see how it works. And we can see it equals 0. If we click on this, click 1 time, it still equals 0. It doesn't update to become 2. If we want something like that to happen, if we wanted to update, what we can do is 2 ways. One, if you were just working regularly in JavaScript, you could add that in handleClick to then also update double count. What you can do in Svelte to make what are called like reactive variables, basically that they're dynamic, they can change. Instead of let, you can put a $sign and a colon. And what that says to Svelte is anytime whatever's on the right-hand side changes, update this variable as well. So now if we have that and we click, we can see that the double count also updates at the same time. Okay, so these are just some of the basic elements of Svelte. All right, now let's go back to our app.svelte. And I'm just going to delete both buttons, because now we are going to create what are called SVGs here. So SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics, and we use it to create data visualizations in HTML because SVG is one of those HTML tags. The reason we would use SVGs versus, let's say, creating an image is that the way SVGs work, because they're vectors, it doesn't matter how much you zoom in, they'll never become pixelated. So they're always going to stay crisp. Versus if you have an image, once you zoom in, it'll become blurry. And so that's why people work with SVGs. If you work in things like Illustrator, you will also have seen SVGs come up. Right, so we're going to create an SVG element here. If you want to copy this over from that original document, you can. I'm just going to type it out so we get the practice of it, and up to you all if you want to kind of copy or just type it out with me. I'm going to close some of these things so we have fewer things we're working with here. Okay. So we're going to open up a less tag for SVG. Close the tag. And then write the closing tag. And this is inside me. And inside the SVG, we're going to give it some properties. So we're going to say width equals, and then in quotations, its value. So we'll say 500. And then we'll give it a height equals, in quotations, 300. And then with CSS styling, you could either write it in your style tag, or what you can do is you could also put it what's called inline, which is when you create the element. So that's what we'll do here. We'll say style equals. And it looks slightly different when you do it in here. So you put it in quotations instead of course, here where we didn't need to do that. And then we'll say, and for this, we'll add a border so we can actually see it, because right now we don't really see anything. So we'll say border, colon, 1px, so 1 pixel, space, solid, space red. So what this will do is it will add a solid red line of 1 pixel wide around where the SVG is. Okay. So now that we've added our SVG, we're going to add some other types of elements inside of it. So first thing we'll add is a rect element, which stands for rectangle. So we'll do rect, and then we'll close it off. Rect. And again, if you want to copy over, that's now skip number 2 for a second, and you can go to number 3. Okay, so for a rect element, there's a couple of different properties that you give it. It's slightly different from the SVG. You give it an X and a Y, which it knows where to start, and then you give it a height and a width. So for our starting point, we'll say, let's say we want to start it a little bit below the beginning of the SVG in quotations. So we'll say 100. And if you, like me, you forgot quotations, you can just highlight the word and add quotations, and I'll add both around, both at the beginning and at the end. We'll give it a Y. So we'll say Y equals, and let's say 10. And then we'll say width equals 300. And then height equals 200. Does anything show up on your screens yet? Yes, on yours it should. On here, I can't really see it because it's black. Let me just give it a border. Stroke equals, let's say, in the other thing, I think I added black, and so you guys can go with black. I'll just go with red for now so I can see it on this screen.
It's showing up.
Yeah, the red border is showing, but the fill is, you can't, yeah. So for you all, if you want to get rid of the fill, you would write fill equals, and then in quotations, none. And that would get rid of the fill. So for yours now, it should just be like a white box with a red border. Okay, so I'm going to add a few things, a little bit of text here, so you guys can kind of start to understand how the XY placing works. You don't need to add this. This is just really for reference more than anything else. If you want to, you can. Okay, I guess let's change the color of all of these things. Just so it's a little bit easier to see on this screen. I think there is a replace somewhere, but for now, I'm just going to write it out. And what this text is doing is it is just telling us where some of these things are located. So this corner is like we did right now, x100, y10. And then we had made the width 300. So this end corner is x400, y10. And then we have a couple other labels here, x100, y160, and then x100, y210. And same over here. All right, so now let's add another rect element. And let's have that one be just for this bottom portion right here. So can someone kind of think through what we might write? If we want it to start here, oh, let me close the tab so it doesn't all disappear for you all. If we wanted to start here and basically span the same width as this bigger box, and then go up until the end of the box. What might we write for our X and our Y? Anybody want to share? I like making things interactive. It's nice. Even if you're not sure, it's always good just to try, because then I can see what everybody's thought process is. So I can at least see like what people are understanding, what maybe is confusing, and I should re-explain. Oh, let me get rid of this stuff because it's not allowing me to see. Okay, anybody have anything they want to share? Maybe on the Zoom, is there anybody who's sharing?
I just asked.
Okay. Otherwise, I'll start us off for now. So our X, right, it's going to be also 100, right? That's what the X is over here. Our Y, the label is there for us, so we're going to make it 160. Our width, because it's the same as the big one, it's also 300. And then our height, if we wanted to just go until this 210 would be 50, right? Because that's the difference between 160 and 210. Okay, and then for this, you can also set this, for you all, you might want to set the stroke to black. I'll just set it to red. One other extra property, or there are multiple other properties. So another thing you can add if you want to kind of make the lines thicker. So we can do that with our, let's do that with our first rectangle maybe. You can say stroke dash width. And I'll add this, I'll move this to the next line so we can kind of see it a little bit better. So I'll say stroke dash width equals, and then you can give it a number. So let's say like, I don't know, 10 or something. And we can also copy that and apply that to the other rectangle as well. Oh, whoops. And then with a rectangle, one other property that you can add, if you want the corners to be a little rounded, you can add a property called Rx and then give it some value. The higher it is, the more it'll be rounded. So if I say Rx equals 20, and sometimes if you don't see it updating, you might need to refresh, or else I might have written something wrong. Oh, I see what I did. I accidentally wrote that in the SVG, which is not where we want it to go. I'm going to delete it, and then I'm going to move it over to my rect properties. And now you can see it's rounded, and we can apply the same one to the next rect as well. Okay, everyone good so far? Okay, awesome. Now we're going to add a line. Actually, let's add a circle element. So again, start with an open tag circle, and then the close tag circle. And obviously nothing's added in yet. And then in that opening tag, we're going to add its properties. So with a circle, you don't specify X and Y, you specify CX and CY. So CX equals, and for this, let's say 250. So it's going to be basically in the center of the circle. And then our CY, we'll set it to 185. And then with a circle, you have to specify what the radius is. So that's R. So we'll say R equals 10.
Someone on Zoom is asking how you set the border radius.
To set the border radius, I added this property stroke dash width to the rect elements, and then I set it equal to 10 here. Okay, any other questions here? Okay, going back to the circle. So like I said, we added the radius. And then let's add a fill to this because we can't see it so far. So let's say fill equals white. And if you can't tell already, I'm building towards a computer screen essentially. Just so that's like a little fun, not just like random shapes. So one of the things that's kind of hard that you'll just have to kind of get used to is the way the different properties that you give it, like one, this is XY with height, this is CX, CYR. If you want to make an ellipse, I think it's like maybe like RX and RY. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's something like that. So if instead of a circle, you want to make an ellipse. Okay, now we're going to make a line. So again, I'm going to open and close. And then with a line, this is where you can create a line with 2 points, a line between 2 points. So there's an X1 and a Y1 and a X2 and a Y2. So we'll say X1 equals, in quotations, 105. Y1 equals 110. X2 equals 150. And notice it's like really easy to make mistakes. Like I forgot an equal sign. And then Y2 equals, and in quotations, let's say 80. Okay, we can't see anything so far because we have to add a stroke to a line. So let's say stroke equals red. And then we can give this a stroke width as well. So I'll say stroke width equals, in quotation, 5. Okay, so that's a line. And I'm going through this part slowly, even though like the making the data viz is like the part that will take us the most time, is because this is the basis of all of that stuff. And so we want to make sure we understand this before we get to that. And later we'll copy more code so that way, you know, we're able to get through some of the concepts. Great, now we're going to add what if you want to create a line with more points than just 2 points. So we're going to create what's called a polyline.
Somebody else is asking if the rect automatically became rounded in SVG.
The rect did not automatically become rounded. It's because I added this property here, Rx equals 20 to it. So if I were to delete this, it would go back to being not rounded. So the default is for it to be sharp corners. And then if you add an Rx property, it becomes rounded. The higher you make it, so if I made this like 100, the more rounded it would be. And then the smaller I make it, the less rounded it would be. Okay, so now we're doing our polyline. So with polyline, because you have multiple, there's a question.
Oh, right. Could you explain what for the line?
Mhm.
Could you explain what this like X1, Y1, and X2, Y2 mean?
Yeah, so the X1, Y1 is sort of like the first starting point. And then the Y1, Y2 is the second point, like where you want it to go to. So this location is 105, 110. So X, Y. And then this one is 150, 80. So one thing that might be a little confusing is like, why is 80 higher than 110? And that's because the way SVGs and the screen works, right? This Y location starts 0 here and then goes down, which is why this is 80 and this is 110. Good question.
Also, other XY are also like positions, right?
Yes, these are all positions and before as well. Okay, awesome. So for the polyline, instead of like specifying like x1, x2, x3, x4, whatever, we just say points equals. And then in quotations, we write out all of our coordinates in here. So we'll start off with the point that we left off with. We're just going to continue this line as if it was just one line. So the first coordinate as we see is 150, 80. And you write it like this instead of having to write out x1, y1, x2, y2, etc. And then after a space, now we'll add our second coordinate. So I'll say 190. So it'll be a little bit more to the right. So 190, probably somewhere around here. And then comma. And then I'll say 130. So again, because of the way it works on these screens, the 0 starts here. So 130 is going to be lower than 80 instead of what we would expect, like when we work with axes, for it to be higher. Okay, and we'll add a couple more. And this one, maybe you might just want to copy over. I'm just going to type it out because I have a piece of paper in front of me that says the text. But again, for you all, I think you might want to just copy this part over and I'll tell you which number it is over here. It is number 6. Actually, maybe I'll just copy it over too. I wrote out the numbers, but just to save us some time writing out the rest of it. Okay, so I've added the points and then I said fill equals none and I gave it a stroke of red. I'm just going to delete this fill equals none for a second so you can see what happens, right? Actually on mine, you can't really tell. I think on yours, if you get rid of the fill equals none, it doesn't look really like a line anymore. It should like have jagged edges and some parts of the thing be filled out. It's almost as if it's sort of creating like a type of polygon, but it's not. And so that's why we'll want to do the fill equals none. Sorry, that part is a little hard to show just because of the, it's the normal fill is like black. I guess I could show if I change this fill to a color. Yeah, so for yours, your fill automatically will look black, something like this. And so we obviously don't want that because we just want a line, which is why we say fill equals none. Oh, what did I just do? Okay. So does that part make sense? These are just coordinates and you just have a space in between them. Usually when you're, unless you like get really good at this, you're not really going to create your SVGs in this way where you like manually specify everything. This is just for us to see how it works. A lot of times people will create SVGs in other like drawing programs and then export them out. Or what we're going to do later is we're going to create it from data. So we're not going to actually manually specify anything. Okay, now let's create a polygon element. And this one I'm definitely going to copy over just because there's so many different values. And a polygon element is just like the polyline, except it closes it off. So you specify same way, a set of points. So in here, if I go back, you'll see I have specified a set of points. And then I gave it a fill. And we're just going to give that to our polygon. And again, because my thing is, it's not going to show up, I'll just change. You can leave it as black. I'll change mine to red. And we can see now we added a polygon on the screen. So if, kind of just covering the coordinates a little bit. So I started here. So this is 230, 220. And I based it off knowing that 250 was in the middle. So I went 20 to the left and then 20 to the right, 270, 220. Then I just moved a little bit down and to the right. So 300, 270, and then I went to the left, so 200, 270, and then it will automatically close off the polygon with the first point. So you don't need to specify that first point at the end. Okay, so that's our polygon. And then the last one, which is the one that's the most flexible, is called a path. So let's add in a path. With the path, you can create things like curved lines. This is where that has the most flexibility. And the way this works, this will have both letters and numbers. And the way the letters work, so you'll have things like M, which says move to this point of line. Then you'll have an L to say create a line to this point. You'll have things like S, which will mean like create a smooth curve, etc., and so on and so forth. So the path that we're going to create, let's copy it over and then I'll explain kind of what it's doing. So it's D element, and then I'll say fill none and stroke green. And we will paste that here. Okay, it's kind of a little hard to see on here, so I'm just going to increase its stroke width. I think on yours it should be fine because it's on the it's on a white screen. So it looks a little not so smooth here. And I think that's just because of the way the screen is. Like on yours, it should look pretty smooth. And so the M says start at 260, 30. So here you don't specify a 30 though, you just write it with spaces. And then an S to say create a smooth curve, you actually give it 2 points, so 2 different coordinates. One is where you want to end, so that's this bottom point, which is 280, 50. And then the thing in the middle is sort of saying it like where you want it to curve. So that's, I did it as if it was this like right-hand corner, 280, 30. And so that's how it knows to curve. Again, you're not really going to do this manually. This is just an example. Okay, otherwise it's kind of hard to sometimes figure these things out. And it takes a little bit of practice to get it right. Like if what I would recommend, maybe like if you want to learn this more and when you go home, kind of like play around with these numbers and see what happens to the curve.
You have a couple of questions.
Yep.
One says, could you explain again what M means?
Yes. Let me see if there's a good documentation. There probably is. Path. M stands for move, but there are other commands. So let's see if they show. Okay, so M. Oh, they like separate them out. Okay, so M stands for move. Then there's one called L, which we'll see here, which says draw a line to this next point. So that's similar to the way when we were just drawing a regular line. Then there are 2 other letters, H or V. H stands for draw a vertical line. And then you just need to give it the next X because it's just going to move over horizontally. If you give it a V, you just need to specify a Y, like what should it go down until? It's going to be a vertical line. And so here, for example, right, this thing that they're creating, they're saying start. So M means move, start at 1010, create a horizontal line to 90. So go over till X is 90. Go V90 means go down till it's 90. H, go back to 10, and then L, create a line to 1010. And then the one that I used was S, and then there's a couple of others in here as well. There's also the difference between capital and lowercase letters, but we're not really going to get into it right now. Okay, and lastly, we'll just create a text element. So I created it before, but I kind of want to show you exactly how it works. So we'll create a text element. And with a text, you just specify X and Y. So I'll say X equals, and I'll make it the same as where this line started. So right here. So I'll say X equals 260, and then Y equals 30. And then we have to specify some text. So outside, like between the 2 tags, we can write a value here. So, or we can write something here. So I can say like test text here. I don't know, whatever you want to write. On mine, it doesn't show because it's black. So I will change the color. With text elements, because it's SVG, you don't change it by saying color, you have to change it by saying fill. So it's different from if somebody has worked with HTML and CSS, it's not like changing the color of font. It works a little bit differently. Okay, and then notice like maybe you don't want it to the right side of where that point is, like maybe you want it to the left, the way the curve is going to the left, so that's not like overlapping. So text has a couple of properties to be able to do that. So one of them is called text anchor. So we'll say text dash anchor equals, and this just tells it like that point that you said X and Y 260, 30. Should it like start the text there? Should it end the text there? Should that come in the middle of the text, etc.? So if we say end, what it will do is the text will end at that point instead of starting at that point.
Just another question in the chat.
Mhm.
Are the X and Y coordinates relative to the element that they're?
Yeah, so it's relative to this SVG. So like the text is only inside the SVG, so it's not relative to any of these rectangles or squares, but it is relative to the SVG. So 0 starts here, which is why Y equals 10 is here instead of, let's say, being somewhere on the top of the screen.
And another one, does the poly connect to the line you drew first?
Yes, it does. So I started it at the end of that first line. So it ended at 150.80, and I just started it in the same place that it ended, which is why it's just like one line now. Okay, and then one other thing that you can add to text is like, do you want it when it aligns with this point, the vertical alignment? Because we did the horizontal alignment, like whether it should end at this point or begin. And then to change the vertical alignment, it's called dominant baseline. And usually we'll just use middle. And so you'll see the text will just move down slightly. So it's just saying like that should fall in the middle. Okay, so these are all the SVG elements. Any questions about everything that we covered?
I have a very naive question. Because I know we're dealing with HTML, CSS,
Yeah.
JavaScript. I guess like what is a good way to how do you explain what Svelte is? Because like it's combining all these different languages together.
Yeah, so Svelte is a framework for working with these things. So it's really it's meant for creating apps. So like, you know, building something, and it allows you to kind of put these things together. There are a lot of other frameworks. There's things like React. You'll find a lot of other ones that exist as well. And they just essentially try to make it easier to work with these different things and allow you to create applications, let's say, that use have multiple pages or make things easier, etc. So with Svelte, you can create all kinds of apps, but it's like particularly well suited for data viz because of how it was created. So it's created by someone who worked as a graphics journalist at the New York Times. So it was like built because that's what he wanted to make his work easier. And then it's the way it's built, it's like very faster than a lot of other frameworks. And it has things like built-in things for transitions and animation, which is something you'd really commonly want to use for data viz. So it's something like, let's say that's combining all of these things together. And right now, so far, we've barely touched any Svelte so far. Like this is all SVG, which is like just anything that you can put into HTML regularly. I just showed you a couple of the things for Svelte, but later we'll see a little bit more. We're not going to work too much with complicated Svelte terminology, but it's just like putting it all together. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Any other questions? So this is just something that will take time to get used to. Like for me, it's still sometimes I'm confused, or I get confused about like which one takes X1 and 2 and which one takes just X and Y, or like how to write the points, whether to have a space or not. So like these are things that you probably won't pick up super quick. So, you know, don't worry about that part. You just always want to refer then back to the documents that talk about it. Okay, so here we go. We've created like a little computer with a chart on it and then some label for our chart. And it probably looks a little bit better on your computers than it does on mine if you've done it all like black, etc. And now, you know, this is SVGs, how like logos are created, etc. Not necessarily in the web browser, but like in other drawing programs. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start with using Svelte. But first in the slides, I just want to show you. So one of the common things that people will use for visualizations is D3. Because it has a lot of flexibility. If you want to really create very unique custom visualizations, if you want to create something that's like not like regular scatter plot or regular things, then, you know, people will just go with other libraries, but D3 will allow you to create like really unique elements. But it is pretty hard to learn. There's a steep learning curve. And this is kind of the difference, to look at a difference between creating some elements of a chart in D3 versus in Svelte. So in D3, it's called imperative code, where you tell it what you want it to do. So here, for example, we're telling D3, or we're telling the computer, create an SVG. So first select an item on the page, add an SVG to it, give that SVG a width attribute of this value, give an attribute height of this, add a G element. Oh, actually, I didn't cover G elements of SVGs. They're group elements, so they just like group things together. So you just put them around a group of SVG elements. So we're saying add a G element, give it this other style CSS property. And then later we say, okay, add another G element, add data to it. And there's these things called enter and select all, etc. And then it says add a circle for each of those elements, give it the CX, give it the CY, give it this R, give it this fill. So you're like telling the computer each step that you want it to do. Versus in Svelte, you write what's called declarative code, where you just tell it what you want and the computer then figures out how to do it. So here, for our like SVG element, we just say SVG and then width and height, and we just declare them earlier, instead of this step of like going through telling it exactly how to create it. And then for creating all of our circles, so this is Svelte code specifically, this one line, which is each data as D, which is similar to, for those of you who have worked with, you know, other programming languages, it's like a for loop where it just goes over the list, and for each element in the list, it does something. So here we say for each element in the list, we want a circle, and we just say what the CX should be, what the CY should be, what the R should be. So we're just saying what we want to see versus here telling it each step to do. So one, it looks a lot more similar to how like HTML code just generally looks like. So a lot easier to read, and there's a much lower learning curve. And that's why it's like uniquely well suited for database. Okay, any questions about this? So this is why we're going to be using Svelte, and I would recommend it for these kinds of things. So let's go back to our markdown file and scroll down, and then I have a link for you all here. And let's open it in Shoot tab. So this is the one that now we're going to be working in. And I just have like some very few little things already built in. So here's our app.svelte. We have a script tag. We're still going to be using some things from D3 because it is well suited for working with data in different ways, but we're not going to use it to make our chart, but we're going to use it as like helper function. So things like getting the maximum of a list of data, or getting the minimum of this list of data, or like reading in data, etc. So we're going to use it as helper functions or like utility functions. We're going to create our chart in Svelte. So I've imported it so that we're able to use it. So let me get rid of this. We don't actually need this here. And then I've just added comments for like the different things that we'll be doing, and we'll put the code under those sections just so we have a little bit of organization in our code. And then there's just an open main and an open style. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we're going to access our data. So first we'll just say let data equal, and then we'll create an empty set. Let data equals, and then the brackets. We're going to pull the data from the ERC GitHub actually. So you don't need to open up this link because I will give it to you in a second, but I am just going to open it up for us so you can see what it looks like.
I would like to know if there's a link to the slides.
Oh, I already gave them.
I don't think I shared the link to the slides anywhere, these specific slides, or do they mean the markdown file?
I sent them the link to your GitHub repo, but if you
Yeah.
want to share the slides later. then-
Yeah, I'll share the slides later as well. There's not many, there's only like a couple, it's just mostly images, but yes, I will share that as well after. Okay, so in our GitHub repo, so I have this CSV. And so, you know, oftentimes you'll have CSVs that you might have uploaded to GitHub or some other, you know, the pudding or like other organizations may have uploaded, etc. And so if it exists on GitHub, what you can do is if you just press the raw button and now you have this URL, you can just use this URL to pull in your data, which is what we're going to do. One other thing that might be nice, by the way, is if you are in a GitHub repo. So let's go back to our workshops. This is just like a nice thing to know about GitHub, which is like if you add flat in front of GitHub. So if you say flat github.com, it'll give you like a file explorer of different things. So, and then you can look at different files. So right now, this is just like the regular workshops. But if you switch to doing that when you're looking at, let's say the Pokemon one, you'd have this like window to explore the code. You should be able to sort it, etc. So it's like a nice little trick to like look through data sets. Okay, so now that you know where we got the URL from, we'll copy the data, we'll copy the code that actually uses that, which is right here in our markdown file, in that one accessing data section. And again, the numbers are starting back at 1 because now we're in the making our data viz section. So just make sure you pull from here, not from the original one. Okay, so we're going to go here and we're going to paste it. And then once we paste it, I'll kind of walk through what it's doing. Okay, so we're using a function from D3 called CSV, and that's to read in our CSV. So the first thing we give it is our file in quotations. And we could have just written something like let data equals and then d3.csv and then this. But the thing is that it doesn't, when you're pulling from someplace like this, it doesn't immediately give you the results when you're pulling from any file. So that's why we declare this separately. And then inside of d3.csv, we will say let data equal the result of this. So d3.csv, you write the URL in parentheses, and then you put a period, and then you say then. So once it's done pulling, then do something. And then we're saying the result of a URL request is stored in something called res, response. And then the arrows are JavaScript syntax. So it's saying like, what to do once you have the res. And then in curly braces, so we're saying res.slice. And that's just saying take only these 200 rows from the response rather than the whole data set, just because the way Sandbox is, it sometimes glitches a little. So I don't want to work with too much of the data. Normally you'd work, let's say locally. This is just for the purpose of the workshop that we're working in here. And so we're saying slice it. So just give us the first 200 rows and then put that into data. Okay, and let's say now we want to look at the data. We can write JavaScript code. To do that in our script, we can just say console.log and then log our data. Let me maybe hide this now. Okay. Once you press console.log, what it does here in your browser window where you're seeing the results, at the bottom, you'll see something called console. And that just allows you to, it's not rendering anything. It just shows you the result of whatever you logged to the console. So here it shows an empty list. So it doesn't actually show us any response. The reason that happens is because when this page first loads, this hasn't run yet. Like it's not that quick. Like data is just an empty set. So if we put, like we had learned about Svelte, if we put a $sign and a colon here, which says like update every time something in this thing updates, you'll notice now it will actually say there's a list with 200 items and inside there's like multiple objects in there. And if we were to click on the arrow next to it, we can see and open up another object, like let's say 0, we can see the different things that it contains inside of it. So there's variables like abilities, against bug, etc. So the ones that we're going to work with today are this variable called SP attack. We're just going to work with a Pokemon data set. I thought it would be nice to work with something fun rather than something serious. So SP underscore attack, and then we can see a value. And notice it's in quotations, which means it's being stored as text. So that's something we're going to have to keep in mind later. And then we'll work with weight as well. So does the weight of a Pokemon maybe affect how its abilities to attack are? Okay. If you want to log, let's say there's something here. So this part you don't need to follow. I'm just going to show you again, if we're using anything from our script, we use curly brackets. And let's say we say data of 0, and that will just be object. So if we want to kind of see the result of it, we can put around it JSON.stringify. Again, you don't need to do this. This is just like printing out the results for us. We already saw them inside of our console. So this is just like a little extra step just to show you. Why didn't this work? JSON.stringify. Oh, I forgot to import something. Okay, we'll leave this for now. I don't want to waste time with that. It would have just printed out the list for us of the object, the first object. Okay, so now let's actually create some circles for our data. So if we remember, we learned about that each command. And so we're going to do that here. So it starts in curly brackets. So this is Svelte specific. So you have a hashtag and then you write each. And then we'll say the name of the data that we're going over, which we just called data. And we'll say as D. So each time this runs, then every new object, so every new Pokemon is going to be stored in an object called D. Okay, and then let's close it. Before we write what to do inside of it, let's just close it. And that's just going to be curly braces and then the slash each. Okay, right now it shows a little error just because I didn't put anything in here. It doesn't like empty blocks. Okay, so this is like a for loop. So it's saying every time do something. And the data from the Pokemon is going to be stored in D. For now, we're just going to create a regular circle without actually using, but we're going to plot multiple circles. So we'll say circle CX equals in quotations, let's say 10, CY equals in quotations 10, and then R equals 5. And then let's just give it a fill. I don't know, let's say teal. And then close off the circle. And again, you can copy this code from the other page. So notice I get an error. It says circle attempted to close an element that was not open. And if something like that happens and you feel like you put in the right thing, see if you made any typos, which here I did. I put a K instead of an L. Okay. Do you all see circles on your screen? No. Oh, what happened? Why isn't that working? Oh, yes, that's because we need to put a $sign for our data. So $, colon. And then I think it should work. Did I make a mistake somewhere? R equals 5, Bill equals teal. Okay, let's go on for now and see if it shows up once we update it, but otherwise we'll have to do some troubleshooting. Okay, wait, let me just plot a circle. Let's plot a circle outside to see why this might not be working. Oh, it's not showing at all regardless. So maybe I wrote something wrong. Oh, I know why it didn't work. Okay. The reason it didn't work is because you can't draw SVG elements without having an SVG around it. So we didn't add that here, which is why we didn't have it show up. So let's add an SVG here. Let's give it a width. Let's just say like 500 and 500 for height as well. For a second, I got scared there. I was like, what did I do wrong? I was like, are we going to have to end the whole workshop here? So we only see one. But the reason we only see one is because they're all on top of each other, even if there's multiple here. If we were to right click and click inspect, which allows you to see like what's on the page, you can see there's multiple circles, but they're just, we can't see them because they're all in the same place. And I'll just close this window. So now let's update it so it's actually based on the data. And so we could write that here, what we want it to do. And let's do that for, no, actually, let's not do that for now. So we could have just written here like d dot and then whichever variable we want as our x. But what we want to do, let's say later we might need to access that variable inside D. And also, like I said before, it's stored as text, so we need to convert it. So let's create a function that will take our D element, the Pokemon, and return that for us. So let's go up, and I'm going to put this right still inside that access data section. So after my console logging of the data, and I'm going to create a function. So I'll say const, because we're not like updating the function. The function is always going to stay the same. So this is JavaScript language. And we'll create a function called x-access. So this will help us access x inside of our object. By the way, I just from now, I don't know if we'll get through everything because it's already 1:15. Okay. And to write our functions, we're going to say equals. And then you write like, what is the element that you're going to do something with? It doesn't have to be called the same thing as what we called our Pokemon object D, but it is common. You'll see D commonly being used. So we're going to use that. And then you use equal sign and a greater than sign. And so this is like function terminology abbreviated in JavaScript. So this is as if you would write function x-axis, and then in parentheses, you write D, and then you would have curly braces. So the way we had like in our original Svelte that we were looking at before, was it this one? Where we had the button. And so it had this like function. So the name of the function in parentheses would be whatever parameter. And then in curly braces is what it should do. Whereas here we're using this like abbreviated version, which is like, this is the thing in parentheses. This is the name of the function. And then the arrow says like what to do. And so we're going to say our x variable is d.weight underscore kg. And then because, like I said, it's not a number, it's stored as text because we saw those quotations around it. So we're going to tell, we're going to use a JavaScript function to convert it. So we're going to write, the function is called parse, P-A-R-S-E, float. Okay, and let's write out our y1, const y-axis. And again, it equals D. And you guys can copy this if you want from the document, if that is easier for you all. And our SP attack is an int. So we're going to say parse int. And the second word is in capital letters, d.sp underscore attack. And so what this will do, we haven't done anything with it, but if we were to run x-axis on a number, it would take the number, well, sorry, not on a number, in an object, the Pokemon object. Inside of that object, it'll look for the weight underscore kilogram variable, and then it will convert it to a float, and then it will return it to us. So it's a function. It's not a variable in and of itself. And we're going to use that function here in CX now. So instead of 10, we will say x-axis and then open parentheses D. Okay, look, the circles adjusted slightly, but they're kind of hard to see. And then for our CY, we will change this to say y-axis D. Okay, so these values, they all kind of like are situated here. And if again, like if I had said before, like if we inspect again, we can see the circle elements. Where do they go? Let's see if I can click on a circle element itself. And so you can see that it's running the functions, giving some values, whatever. Okay. Again, they're all still there. It's just a little bit hard for us to see right now. The reason is because now what this is doing is it will move it to wherever this value is. So some of the weights are things like 1 kilogram. But if we're working with this in pixels, it'll be just like 1 unit down and 1 unit to the right. And so that's not actually making use of the full width of the screen. So what we want to do is we want to tell our program this 0.1, let it be associated with something else on the page. And then the max value, let's say like 40, I can't remember what it is, like 100 maybe, I don't know. Whatever that is, let it be associated with the full width of the page. So that way we actually use all of this space to make our chart. So this part is a little confusing. I have a little slide to help with that. One of them is made by Amelia Wattenberger, who is like an expert on this type of work. So this image is showing what we're going to do. We're going to create a new function called xScale, and it's going to translate our data from one side to the other. So here's an example of if you were working with dates. So you have your lowest value up top, you have your highest value at the bottom, and then you're going to say what it should be associated with. So what is the minimum value in pixels for that to be associated with, and then the maximum. So what this would do is convert these values. So let's say if this is the lowest value on your x-axis, it'll say start at 0 pixels x. And this is horizontal because it's x, right? And if the highest value should be at 800, so it should basically span the width of the page. So we're going to create an xScale function. So let's go to our markdown file. And that is number 5. We'll come back to 4 in a second. So that's number 5. So let's copy 5. And we'll start with xScale and then we'll work with yscale in a second as well. Okay, let's go back to our code. And this should go inside our script. And there's a section called scale. So that's where we're going to put it in. Okay, right now we'll get an error. That's okay. We're going to work through this and see what's happening. Okay, so I created a function called xScale. And then we're using a function from D3 to create that for us. We're using something called D3.scaleLinear. There are others for if you're working with time, there's a scale time. There's things if you don't want it to be linearly, if you want it to be like log, etc. Ours is regular data, so we'll just do scale linear. And then we're going to do chaining, which is again, just something you do in JavaScript /D3 with the periods. So the first thing we specify is what's the domain and what's the range. Just like these images, what is the domain and what is the range to match it to? So for the range, let's skip domain for a second. For range, and you have to give it a list of values, which is why they're in these brackets. So the first thing is 0. So we're just going to start at 0 pixels. And then we want it to go until the width of the page. We could have written here 500 if that's the width that we're doing our SVG in. But it's good to use these type of parameters. So if we're going to keep referring to them, just like, for example, here we refer to width as well, we should create a variable that stores that value. And then this thing .nice true, it just like rounds the numbers out to create a nicer scale, like what's the minimum and what's the maximum. And the yscale is doing something similar, again, but going from 0 to height instead. Okay. And then the domain, we could have just written like some value based on what we know might be the minimum and the maximum of weight or the minimum and maximum of SP attack. But we're going to use, again, a function from D3 called D3.extent. And what that does is it gives you the min and the max of a data set. So we'll give it our data. So you give it your data set and then you tell it what to access within it. So we're going to use our x-axis function so that it knows to explore this weight kilogram value to figure out the min and the max. So first it takes the data set and then it takes a function. Okay, and so this will return to us the min and the max of the x value. And then here it will return to us the min and max of the y value. And one other thing you may notice is I have a $sign here. And that's because anything that works with the data needs the $sign because, as we saw before, the data doesn't immediately load. Okay, so now let's make this error go away by creating our width and our height. So in dimensions, let's say let width equal 500. Oh, and we don't need to do this in quotations here because this is not HTML anymore. It's just JavaScript. I'm gonna say let height equal 500 as well. Okay, and let's update now our CX and our CY. So instead of just getting x-axis of this value, we're also now going to apply this function x scale to it so that it takes this x value and then converts it to what it should be based on its pixels. So we're gonna write x scale around this. And here we'll add y scale around our y. This. Okay. So anybody notice why that might not have worked? If you all remember, I had said if we want to use anything from our script, we have to put curly braces. So instead of quotations here, I have to put a curly brace and also a curly bracket around here. And same thing here. And now you should see the circles populate all across the page. Mine is a little more zoomed in, so it's filling my whole thing. I think you all probably have some extra white space at the bottom. Okay, and let's change one other thing, which is now that this width, instead of it being set to 500, let's pull from this width variable and then the height from the height. So this, don't follow along for 1 second, where I'm going to say what we could do is we could have just ran instead of 500, we could say width equals and then curly braces width to pull from what we wrote in our script. But if you ever have a situation like this, where the thing you're setting it equal to has the same name as the thing that you stored it in, you can just write that name in curly braces. You don't actually need to write width equals width or height equals height. You can just put curly braces around the whole thing. So that's what I'm going to do here. So our width and our height now, they're going to be associated with this. So if I were to change my width to, let's say 800, this would automatically then update. Okay, let me show you this slide for a quick second. So again, just to understand how it's working, first we have our data object. Our x-axis is converting it to a x value, right? So this is going to give us convert the weight kilogram into a number instead of being text. And then x scale is going to convert that based on where it falls in the domain to a pixel value. And again, just looking back here, right, the lowest value is associated with the lowest range in pixels, the highest with the highest. So let's say if you have something in the middle, it would be associated with somewhere in the middle. If you want to explore some of that, I will show that for you here, where if we wanted to look at, I'm just going to log our scale domain. So if I say xscale.domain and put parentheses, why didn't it print for us? Oh, it did. Here we go. So it tells us, oh, our x scale goes from 0 to 10. So that is the weight range in here. If we say x scale dot range, we know that's our 0 to 500. Same thing for y scale. We could also do if you want to see where something falls. So like, let's say if we do invert and we say 6. Oh, sorry, the other way around. So let's say we say like, what is at 400? It will tell us what value falls there. So 8. And so that's how it's kind of working. This is going backwards instead of going forwards. And so that's intuitively what it's doing. It can be a little bit hard to understand. And again, that's just something to kind of play around with. Okay. Can anyone think of where we might have made a mistake or like why something based on what we already kind of learned about where the Y pixels live? What issue we might run into? So if you remember before, right, we said that the Y worked opposite to the way like an axis might work, where instead of going up as you go up, the pixels were instead working the opposite way. And so if we associate our data in this way, where the minimum is associated with 0 and the maximum is associated with the maximum height, what's going to happen is our chart is actually going to be flipped. So the lowest value is going to be here and the highest is going to be here instead of the other way around. So to flip it, and again, I have an image here just to kind of show that, where like if we did it the normal way, right? Our y-axis, the 0 would be associated with 0, and then the whatever highest value, let's say 120 if it was, would be associated with wherever the bottom of our 300 pixels is. We don't want it to be this way, right? Because our axis is supposed to go from 0 up, which is why we're going to convert it so it works this way, where 0 is at the bottom and 120 is at the top. And so what we need to do is tell our y scale that we want the minimum to be associated with 300 or whatever our height is, and then our 120 to be associated, or whatever the value is, to associate with 0. So to fix that, we're going to switch our height and our 0. So for range, we're going to say height, comma 0 instead of 0, comma height. And notice now the chart looks a little different. Okay. You'll notice that some of our chart is getting cut off. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add margin to our chart. We're going to add margin to our chart so we have space around it. And again, I have an image from Amelia Weinberger. She created these sort of terms to help understand positioning of the chart, where whenever you have your chart, there's one part of the chart that has data, which she calls bounds. But then there's also a lot of extra space around the chart, right? Wherever you have your labels, your axis ticks, etc. So what the bounds is where the data should live, but the wrapper, the whole, which we would call our whole SVG, is the full thing. And this is what we could call our margin between the wrapper and the bounds on all the sides. Okay, so let's copy code from our thing here, just so we can kind of move a little faster. So number 6, copy that code and bring it into our starter. And then I'm going to paste it under dimension. It doesn't really matter where you paste it. I just want to stay organized. So I'm just going to put it under each section. So we're creating an item called margin. And this time it's not just a single value. We're basically creating an object and it has 4 values. It has a left, top, right, and bottom. So we're saying from the left, there should be a little bit of margin. Top, we don't really care because the chart can go until the top. On the right, we just need a little bit of margin because notice like we don't usually have a lot of stuff on the right. And then on the bottom, we want 30 because we need space at the bottom for our axis. Okay, and then now we need to know what is our new bounds width, like what should the data actually go within. And so that's going to be our regular width minus the margin left minus the margin right. And then the bounds height would be minus height minus the margin top and minus margin bottom. Does that make sense, everybody? And so now we need to update some of our code to reflect that. So here, instead of going from 0 to width, we'll say go from 0 to bounds width. And then for height, we'll say this should be from bounds height to 0. Okay, so we've only changed the X scale so far. We actually also have to change things here so that it actually knows to do that. Because our data, yes, now it knows that it should go instead of from 0 to, let's say, what was it, 500. Now it should go to like what, 460. But the 0 still starts here. It hasn't like known that it should move to the left. So one, we could have changed this 0 here to say margin.left, so it knows to start there. But we're not going to do it that way because we're going to run into some other things later. And so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to actually wrap all of this in a G element, which I didn't cover that much, but a G element is just grouping things together. We're going to group all our circles together, and then we're going to move them over. Okay, so again, I'm just going to pull that from our code here as well. So that's number 7, shifting our data. and then I'm pasting that. And let me just add some space here so you can see where I'm putting it. So this E around the each. I'm putting that right at the beginning of the each. And then I have to close it off at the end. So the closing it off is just /G at the end. And what we're saying here is we're applying this transform property to it, which is a CSS property. And with transform, you can do things like rotate, etc. And so one of the things that you can do with transform is translate, which is like move it over. And then you give it two values in parentheses, one, how much to move X and how much to move Y. And then we're going to use our margin left and our margin top to say, move a little bit to the left and then move down a little bit. Our margin top is 0, so it's not actually going to change the top, but it will change the left-hand side, which is why now we see this extra white space here. And they're in curly brackets because we're pulling from our script. Does that sound good to everybody so far? Okay, great. So now our bounds for our data are a little bit smaller than the rest of where the SVG ends. I'm just going to add a little bit of styling here. You don't need to do this. This is really just so that you can kind of see where things exist. So I'll add a border around our SVG, and then let me add, where should I add this? Okay. I'm going to add a temporary rect element as well, so you can also see where our bounds live. Again, this is not something you need to do. I'm just going to add it so that you're able to kind of see what's going on. Okay. So I just translated the rect the same amount. And so then because it's translated, I can just set its X and Y to 0, and it will live wherever it should live. And then I'll make the width bounds width, and then the height bounds height. And let me give it a stroke of blue. Okay, so now you can see it might be a little bit hard to see, but hopefully you can kind of see that it ends, there's that extra space, the margin at the bottom, and that extra space margin on the left, and a slight amount on the right. And if we could also add some at the top, and that would also bring our circle down a little bit and maybe like not cut it off. So let's maybe just change our top to like 10 or something as well. Okay. I'm going to pause and go to a different example for a second, just to show you how you would do a line, because it's a little bit different than how you do like circles. This wouldn't be well situated for a circle, for a line graph. And so I'm just going to move to this one for a second, just to show you all what it looks like. And I'll share the link to this later as well. So far, everything else is the same, the d3.csv, X axis and Y. The only thing difference is because we're working with a date, I had to say new date around the thing I'm using. Weight, width, and height I've like set here as well, the X scale, Y scale, etc. So the one thing that I've done differently here is to create a line. We're going to use these two things. One, we're going to use a function from D3 called d3.line, where you tell it what the X and Y should be. And so here we use that function, JavaScript notation, the D arrow, and then we say we want to do X scale, X axis of D. So that's how it knows like where for your line, the X should be, and then where your Y should be. And then this is a function that generates the line. So to actually generate the line, you run it on your data. So we run line generator on data, and then we put it into something called line data. And because all of this is based on the data, we have to put the $sign and the colon. And then now, because we don't need to do the each anymore, so I have the each here because I added the circles as well. But to create the line, you just create a path element. And then for D, remember our path had a D element where it would say like M, you know, and then coordinates, etc. And you just give it that line data inside of it. The line data will contain the whatever capital letters it needs, and all the coordinates that it needs to create the line. And then I just added like a couple of properties so we can see what it looks like. And so creating a line is just 2 extra steps. Okay, it's a little different than the way the circle works because we have to generate that code for creating the path. Compared to for here, we just needed the coordinates. Okay. Let's go back to our code. Okay. So now we need to add our axis elements, right? So we want our axes here. So at the very top, I've kind of given you a little bit of boilerplate code in like our axis X. You can look, it's very minimal yet. We still have to kind of build it up. And so we are going to, in our app code at the very top, we'll say import. Actually, let's just copy from the thing just to save us time. So scroll down. That is number 10. Okay, that's going to import our axis components. And we're going to paste that up here. And that's saying import X from axis X.svelte. And then import axis Y from axis Y original. Okay, what is this error? Let's see, let me refresh if there is, no, what happened? Are you all also having this error? Okay, I think it might be this, so let's write original here. Okay, let's keep going for a second and see. Maybe it has something to do with something inside the code that we're going to adjust anyways. Okay, so we just said import X from axis X.svelte, and then import axis Y original from axis Y original.svelte. Okay, and then here in axis X, all I have is a line. And no, remember before with lines, we had like X1s, X2s, Y1s, Y2s. If you just specify, like, let's say an X1, it just places it wherever the default SVG is like 0, 0 is. And it gives it just a width of that value if it's just X1. If it was in our axis Y original, I wrote Y1 equals 300. So it just gives it a height of 300. And the X just gets located at the 0 of the SVG. We'll see why this error is happening. I think it might be because of this script being empty. But for now, let's keep going and then let's make a couple edits because I don't know if maybe some of these things are causing it. So in our script, actually not in our script, let's just delete this stroke equals light gray. Yes, because I put 2 of them. Actually, let's delete our stroke equals black. Let's keep them light gray so that our lines don't take up a lot of attention. Oh, although on mine, they probably don't show up, but on yours, they should. Do they show up on yours? Okay. Okay, yes, we're gonna fix that. Okay. And that's because even though we imported it here, we don't actually use that anywhere in our code. Okay, so we're going to put those inside our SVG. So after your G element, actually, let's put it before our G elements because the thing puts in order. And so we'd rather have these go on top of our axes if there's any overlap rather than the lines go on top of or on below the axes, below the circles. Okay, so let's put that at the very beginning of the SVG. And what we're going to say is now that we've imported it, we can write it out here. So we're going to say axis X. And remember what we had seen before with the button that you just write it in capital letters and then you close it off with just the slash and the greater than sign. And then let's also put our axis Y. Sorry, axis Y original, since that's what we've called it. On mine, it's not really going to show because I had made it light gray. if I go back here and let's say I make it, green, maybe it'll show up. Yeah, it's hard to tell because it's like overlapping with the red, but notice my line up here looks a little different now. And yours should show up. Does yours show up on yours? Yeah. Yeah. So yours should show up because you also didn't add like the SVG border. Let me also get rid of the border for now. Maybe that will help a little bit. Yeah, so now you can see that green line is at the very top. Obviously, we don't want the axis X line to be at the very top. We want it to be at the bottom. And similarly for the Y, let me also change my Y coloring so we can see it. Our original stroke equals, and I'll make this green as well. And you can see it's like at the very edge. On yours, of course, that one should also show up. And it's at this very edge. Okay, so we're gonna fix some of these things now. So let's go back to our app. .Svelte. And to move them where they should be, we're going to use our G grouping element again. Okay, so we're going to add a G around axis X, and then we're going to add a G around axis Y. So first, let's add it around axis X. So we're going to say G transform equals, and you could copy one of these at the bottom if you want to like help you give it context. I might just do that too, just to make sure I don't make any typos. But we don't want it to translate both of these things. All we want it to do is just move to the bottom. Okay, so we are going to move it actually margin top plus bounds height. So bounds height plus margin top. Oh yeah, the reason it's moving everything is because I didn't close off the G. So after axis X, let's close off our G. And now it should be there. Yeah, it's hidden by the blue border. So let me get rid of the blue border as well, so you guys can see it now. And so you can see now it's at the end of our data where it should be. And what I translated it by, I moved it left so that it starts here. And then I translated down by both the margin top and then the width, the height. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, great. And let's do the same thing for our Y. So again, let's just copy this to make our lives easier. Paste that here and make sure you close off the G first so you can actually see what it's looking like. We don't want it to translate the same way. For our Y, we really just need it to move over and slightly down, right? So the margin left is fine, but for this, we just needed to move down by margin dot top rather than bounds height as well. And so now we have it on the left-hand side. It's not the right height, but that's fine. We'll fix that. Okay, does that look good to everybody? Do you all have the same thing? Okay, great. So now what we're gonna do is, well, we have 10 minutes. Let me think. Let me see where we're at. Okay, I'm gonna skip a little bit of this or like not go into it in detail so that I can show you some of the other things that Svelte has available. So we're not gonna fix the axis X for now, but for Y, I've actually given you the full code here because I was gonna walk you through the X and then just give you the full Y. And so we'll just pull in the full Y here. So change this from dot axis Y original to just dot axis Y. And we can leave the name the same, the axis Y original, because it doesn't really matter what we call this. That's what I thought the error was before, but it wasn't related to that. It's going to say cannot read properties. That's fine because I'll show you what axis Y Svelte looks like. To create our axis Y and to kind of work with these things, if we want it, we could have just told it like, okay, actually, let me comment this out for a second so you understand what I'm trying to talk about. To create our like to tell it how long to be, and then also like what these values should be, etc. It needs to know things about our data. It needs to know also what our bounds height is, etc. And so we want to pass those things to axis Y. We could have written them manually because we know what they are, right? Like we know the height is whatever it was, like 500 or 300, 500. Or we know some of the other aspects of like what are the values that go on the axis. But the good thing about using things like Svelte and like creating these separate files is that you can reuse them. So that way, like, let's say if you wanted to create 2 y-axes, you don't actually need to then create 2 separate files. You just have one, but each time just pass it different things so that it knows how to update it. So each time you tell it like where it should go, and then what values to use for the axis. And so to do that, we need to pass things to it. So if you want to pass things to it, what you do is wherever you have your axis Y aspect, your component pulled in, you give it whatever you want to give it. So we're going to say count equals. And this we're using to tell it how many like tick marks to create. And so we'll say like 5, I guess. And then some of the other things that it needs to know is like the bounds height. But to give it the bounds height, we could either give it bounds height, or what is actually more useful, because we're also going to need it for other things, is our Y scale. Because it's going to need the Y scale to know where to put the tick marks, so they're always in the right place rather than like randomly placed. So we're going to say Y scale equals, sorry, I think I called it scale. So we have to say scale equals, and then in brackets, Y scale. And then we're actually also going to give it X scale, I think. Yes, we also give it X scale. So we're going to say X, and then in brackets, just say X scale. Some of this, unfortunately, it will not, I know it will be confusing because we are skipping over a little bit of stuff. And that's just because I kind of want to show you some of the other things that it Svelte can do. Okay, so now we've given it these properties. And then in axis Y, the way you accept the properties is you write in the script, you write export and then let on whatever the name you created. So export let scale, export let X scale, and then export let count. And so that's how we accept these in axis Y. Okay, and then some of the other things that I'm doing here, again, I'm not going to walk through this in full detail, is that I'm using this function that D3 has called .ticks, which just like based on the number that you give it, it tries to figure out what the label should, some of the labels should be. And then I'm using this each code to put in each of our ticks. I'm using a G group to translate that over. And then the line and text, etc., is going there to kind of situate. And then we're having something that says the name of the variable. Okay, so let's kind of pull it all together. So in app.svelte at the very top, change axis Y original to say axis Y. And now you should see that there are these lines that go across. And then the text, unfortunately, it's black because on yours it should show. On mine, it doesn't show. Let me change the color to red, and then maybe it'll show. Oh, let me try. Here we go. We can see them slightly. They'll probably like show up better on yours than on mine. But what I've done here is, like I said, so here the G transform is saying to translate these lines. Nothing, it doesn't matter how much to the left. We don't really need to translate this. And then scale of Y for each tick. So each tick returns whatever its Y value is supposed to be, like 40 or 80 or whatever. And then the scale tells it where on the page it should go. And so each tick and the line and the value, we've moved it down to wherever it's supposed to go. And then for these lines, we've all just made we made each of these just the width of the chart, which is why we use X scale here. And we say use the range. And then inside of the range, if we get the first thing in the range, that is the width. And then we have the text, etc. And then you'll notice one other thing that we haven't seen before is I wrote X equals -5. If you say negative, it just moves to the left of wherever you want or wherever you've kind of situated it. So that's why this is over here. On yours, it's definitely going to look better than on here. Okay. Feel free to like book an appointment with me later to kind of go over some of these things because I did go over it really, really quickly. Now let's just make our chart responsive. So that way it like resizes accordingly, like when you stretch, because that's a big thing that you need to work with when you work on the web. So let's go to our app. And to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to add a div element, a figure element outside of our SVG. Okay, and then at the end of our SVG, let's close it off. And the reason we do this is because when you have some type of HTML element that's not an SVG, you can grab its width from the page. To grab it, you write, and we're going to go back to our code so we can just copy it over, and that's scrolling down all the way to 17. We have this thing called bind client width. So this is an HTML property. And we're saying store this in width and then bind client height, store this in height. So what that will let us do is make this responsive. Let's go over here. Let's put that in here. And so now it's going to take the width of that figure. And we want this figure to take the full space, so 100% of the page. So we can say width equals, and in quotations, 100%. Okay, and actually, no, let's not do this. Let's put in the styling because it might mess up the way these get associated with each other. So to give it styling, we're going to give it a class. So we're going to say class equals, and this is a CSS thing, wrapper. And then in our styling, I think I also put that in here. Yeah, the wrapper styling, just copy that over. And paste that in style. And then now it was supposed to, but it doesn't. Why doesn't it? And that's because we need to do one extra step, which is that when we set our bounds width, we just wrote let, but now that width can change, we need to use the reactive $ here. So that way now it can actually update according to the chart changing. So normally with like other things, making it responsive takes a lot of extra work. Whereas in Svelte, it's like really easy to do. Okay, I'm going to kind of stop here with the code. I have the full code in one of these other sandboxes. So I'm just going to pull it up so I can show you that there is a lot of other stuff we can do. Let me save this first. This just took longer than I expected it to. I mean, it is the first time that we're teaching this workshop. Yeah. Oh yeah, I have to sign in first. I think this is the one. Some of it's a little off because I ended up fixing it after and I didn't update this code, but you can see, if you notice, there was animation when it pulled in. And then when I hover over it, it also like the look updates and there's like a tooltip associated with it. And so some of those things are like in the code here, and you can definitely take a look also here where I add some of that stuff. I'll try to also make this a little bit more detailed so that way you can understand what's going on. Another thing that's here, which is super important when we're thinking about accessibility, it's also only really the start of the accessible aspect. And there's definitely more to think about, but as you press tab, you're able to move from circle to circle. So that accessibility wise, that's super important. And Svelte actually like prompts you if you don't. So if you try to do this like on mouse over do something and you don't include the thing that allows you to do this tabbing, you will get, it says AIIY, which stands for accessibility. It says on mouse over must be accompanied by on focus. So that's like prompting you. So hopefully people will try to be more mindful of keeping their charts accessible. Okay. So we'll stop here. Are there any questions in terms of what we did end up covering? I know it was a lot. It's like really hard to wrap your mind around. I think when I first learned all of this stuff, it was like 4 different sessions altogether. And so that's why we obviously couldn't get through everything. Hopefully maybe we can do it like a part 2 at some point. Yeah.
On all the steps are in the GitHub. that you shared.
The code is there, but like the directions exactly aren't there. So it might not be clear where things go. So I'll try to fill it out within the next few weeks. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Comments?
And one thing I'll just add is like, this is like a basic chart that you might create regularly, which is still important to like add the interactivity, etc. But like really where things like Svelte and D3 shine is when you want to make something really custom where the database doesn't look like this. And so for example, in here, I have one example linked. I think it's this one. Again, created by Amelia Wattenberger. And I'll just pull this up so you can see these out. And then also you can take a look at what the stuff that the pudding, etc. is posted. And so here we have this like spiral chart for temperature on Mars over the years. And so like, this is what I mean by when trying to create custom charts that you really can't create in any other thing. Like a regular scatter plot, you could probably find other things to create it in, even other things that will make it interactive. But this is the kind of stuff you wouldn't be able to.
Thank you so much.